Sketch was, by any reasonable standard, a very simple drawing. Two small dots for eyes, a gentle curve for a mouth, a round head balanced on a thin stick of a body, four straight little limbs, and, most importantly as far as Sketch was concerned, a neat scribbled tuft of hair sitting right on top of his head. That tuft had been there from the very first line of him. It was, in a quiet way, the one thing about Sketch that felt like it was truly his. So on the morning this story begins, when Sketch climbed onto his little stool to look at himself in the mirror and noticed that the tuft looked somehow smaller than it had the day before, he did what any reasonable stick figure would do. He leaned in closer, he squinted, and then he made a small, high-pitched sound that no stick figure is ever proud of. The line where his hair ended had moved. Not by much, just a little. But it had moved backward, up his round head, retreating like a tide going out and taking the shore with it. Sketch pressed both stick hands flat against the top of his skull as if he could hold the hair in place by sheer force of worry. It did not help. It never helps. But he tried anyway, because he was frightened, and fear rarely waits for a good plan. And here is the thing worth knowing before we go any further. Sketch was not the first to feel that exact cold jolt of panic in front of a mirror. He was, in fact, joining a line of frightened creatures that stretches back thousands and thousands of years. He simply did not know it yet. Because roughly 3,500 years before Sketch ever noticed his shrinking tuft, in the year 1500 before the Common Era, a balding Egyptian man stood in front of a polished bronze mirror and saw, just like Sketch, far more scalp than he wanted to see. And that man did something remarkable. He recited a magic spell to the sun god, and then he swallowed a cocktail of onions, iron, red lead, honey, and crushed alabaster, all in the desperate hope that his hair would come rushing back. It did not work. A few centuries later, around 1100 before the Common Era, a whole new generation of increasingly desperate Egyptian men tried something even stranger. They rubbed fat from lions, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, ibex, serpents, porcupines, and geese directly onto their bare scalps. The idea, as far as anyone can tell, was that some of the animal's strength and vitality might soak through the skin and wake up whatever had gone to sleep underneath. That did not work either. When even that failed, someone apparently suggested frying the leg of a female greyhound in oil, mixing it with donkey hoof, and smearing the result across the head like an ointment. And after that, when the hair still refused to return, the Egyptians did the only sensible thing left to do. They gave up on curing it. They started wearing wigs instead. Sketch, of course, knew none of this. Standing on his little stool, he only knew that his tuft was shrinking and that he wanted, more than anything, to make it stop. So he began his own campaign, his own war against the retreating line. He tried rubbing things on his head, anything he could reach. He tried standing on his hands so the blood would rush up and feed the roots. He tried talking to the tuft gently, encouragingly, the way you might talk to a plant you were afraid was dying. He tried, for one embarrassing afternoon, wearing a small drawn hat and pretending the whole problem simply did not exist. None of it worked. The line kept creeping backward, patient and unbothered, and with every passing day, Sketch felt a little smaller, a little more defeated, a little more alone. That was his mistake, though he did not know it. The feeling of being alone, because Sketch was standing at the near end of a story that was 4,000 years long, and he had not yet turned around to look at everyone standing behind him. One evening, exhausted from another failed remedy, Sketch sat down on the edge of the page and asked the only question that actually mattered. Not how do I stop it, but why? Why is this happening to me at all? And the moment he asked why instead of how, the whole world seemed to lean in and finally begin to explain itself. The answer, it turned out, began somewhere very small, smaller than Sketch had ever imagined. It began inside the hair follicles themselves, in tiny glands that produce oil, where a quiet chemical process had been unfolding this entire time, completely without his knowledge. Inside those glands lived an enzyme, a kind of biological worker with a long and complicated name. Type 2, 5-alpha reductase. Its job was simple. It took ordinary testosterone, the hormone flowing through Sketch's body, and converted it into a stronger, sharper form called dihydrotestosterone. Most people just call it DHT. And DHT, in follicles that happen to be genetically sensitive to it, is the reason the tuft was disappearing. Sketch pictured it almost like a tiny, mischievous character living at the root of each hair. Not evil, exactly. Just doing a job, it did not understand the consequences of every time DHT touched a sensitive follicle, it quietly shortened the hair's active growing phase, the stretch of time when a hair is supposed to grow long and thick and strong. And with each new cycle, that follicle grew a little more timid, a little smaller, producing a thinner, weaker, paler hair than the time before, until eventually all it could manage was a nearly invisible wisp of fuzz where a proud strand used to be. Do that across enough follicles, all clustered at the temples and the crown of the head, and you get exactly what Sketch was seeing in the mirror: a receding line, a thinning top, and, in the most advanced cases, nothing left but a horseshoe-shaped rim of hair around the back and sides, curving from ear to ear like a fallen crown. But here was the strange and almost funny part. The sides and the back of Sketch's head were completely fine, untouched, stubbornly, almost mockingly full. And Sketch wanted to know why the DHT bothered the top but left the sides alone. The answer was that the follicles on top of the head simply carry far more of the receptors that DHT latches onto. The sides and back carry very few. So the same hormone flows past every follicle equally, but only the ones on top are wired to listen. That uneven wiring is written into the genes themselves, which is exactly why the horseshoe pattern looks nearly identical on every balding head that has ever existed, in every country, in every century. It is not random bad luck. It is a precise, predictable outcome, playing out the same way on every sensitive scalp that has ever been drawn. This discovery changed something in Sketch. His problem, which had felt like a personal insult, a punishment aimed at him alone, was starting to look more like a law of nature, as ordinary and impersonal as rain. And it went deeper still, because Sketch learned that this was not some rare curse handed only to the unlucky few. Researchers once studied more than 200,000 men and found the trait to be powerfully inherited, with roughly 62% of the difference between balding and non-balding men traceable directly to genetics passed down through the family. A massive study once mapped more than 600 separate spots in the genome linked to hair loss. And one particularly strong cluster sat on the X chromosome, the one a person inherits from their mother's side, which is why that old family wisdom, the idea that baldness comes from your mother's father, actually turns out to have real science behind it, and is not just something an uncle invented to avoid taking the blame. So, this was not one single villainous gene waiting to flip on like a light switch. It was hundreds of tiny genetic ingredients, mixed together in different amounts in different people. Sketch had simply been handed a particular recipe. And that recipe, he was about to learn, had traveled an astonishing distance to reach him. Because when researchers looked at this trait across the whole world, they noticed something that should stop anyone in their tracks. Many of the genetic pieces behind hair loss are ancient, older than modern humans themselves, shared in loose and scattered forms across our deep family tree. But how common those pieces are changes dramatically depending on where a population's ancestors came from. They show up far more often in people of European descent, and far less often in people of East Asian descent, even comparing men of exactly the same age. This uneven scattering led one researcher, Charles Ryan, who wrote a book called The Virility Paradox, to a genuinely thrilling idea. If you line up the genetic markers for baldness against the great migrations of ancient humans crossing the Earth, you can begin to trace where the common form of this trait most likely took hold. The markers appear reliably in populations descended from people who journeyed into Europe and the Middle East, and are largely missing in many populations who never made that particular trip. The suggestion is that the widespread version of baldness we know today most likely emerged sometime after early humans walked out of Africa and into Europe, an event that happened around 40,000 years ago. Sketch sat very still when he understood this. 40,000 years. His shrinking tuft was not a flaw that had appeared in him one random morning. It was, in a sense, a souvenir. A tiny hormonal sensitivity that had followed his ancestors out of Africa, across continents, through 40,000 years of history, waiting patiently in the genes the entire time, riding along quietly from one generation to the next until it finally arrived, at long last, on top of one small stick figure's head. But this raised a puzzle that Sketch could not shake. If baldness is this ancient, then who was the very first to actually go bald? Which ancient human, standing in some forgotten cave, first reached up and felt the top of their head growing bare? And the honest, slightly humbling answer is that we may never know, because most early humans never lived long enough for it to show. Male pattern baldness usually only becomes visible somewhere between the ages of 25 and 50. Roughly a third of men show thinning by 30. Roughly half show real loss by 50. It creeps in slowly, over years, sometimes decades. And, as Charles Ryan bluntly points out, early humans very often simply did not live that long. They were dying young of infections, of injuries, of the countless dangers of a wild and unforgiving world, long before their hairline ever had a chance to retreat even a single step. The genetic machinery for baldness may have been fully built and ready to go for tens of thousands of years, sitting there loaded and waiting, before anyone actually managed to survive long enough to reveal it. Now, Sketch nearly misunderstood something here, and it is worth slowing down for, because a lot of people trip on it. When you hear that ancient life expectancy was around 30 or 35, it is easy to imagine everyone simply dropping dead at that age like clockwork. But that is not what it means at all. The average was dragged down by heartbreakingly high numbers of infants and young children who did not survive. The adults who made it past childhood could, and sometimes did, live well into their 50s, their 60s, and beyond. So some ancient humans absolutely did go bald. There were surely a few gray, bare-headed elders sitting by ancient fires. There were just far fewer of them than there are today, when nearly everyone lives long enough to find out whether the trait was hiding in them all along. Around this point in his journey, Sketch got curious about something else. Was he the only kind of creature this happened to? And so he went looking among the animals, and what he found was stranger and more confusing than he expected. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, sharing more than 98% of our DNA, can in some cases lose a great deal of their hair, sometimes almost all of it. But here is the twist. Their hair loss does not follow the human pattern at all. There is no receding temple, no thinning crown, no horseshoe, which tells researchers that chimp baldness is not coming from the same source as ours. It is a case of what scientists call parallel evolution. The same rough outcome, hair loss, arriving independently through two completely separate paths, the way both birds and bats ended up with wings without ever sharing a winged ancestor. Macaques, a kind of monkey more distant from us, also lose hair sometimes, but theirs seems tied, at least partly, to stress and to pulling their own hair out. And it shows up in males and females at roughly equal rates, which means it is running on a completely different mechanism than the hormone-driven process in human men. And then there are gorillas and orangutans, our other great ape cousins, who by and large do not go bald in any comparable pattern at all. So there is no tidy story here. No neat rule where all primates lose their hair the same way. Whatever pressures carved out the specifically human version of this trait, they seem to have done it on their own, quietly, apart from the rest of the family tree. Which brought Sketch to the biggest question of all, the one that had been sitting under everything. If baldness helps nobody survive, if it makes no creature stronger or faster or safer, then why on earth has evolution allowed it to stick around for tens of thousands of years? Why did it not simply weed the trait out? And the answer, when Sketch finally understood it, gave him an unexpected kind of peace. It turns out the same genetic study that mapped those 600 spots found that the genes behind baldness are quietly tangled up with several other traits. Things like reaching puberty earlier, having denser, stronger bones, and certain features of how the body manages its own chemistry through the pancreas. Scientists call this pleiotropy, when a single gene, or a cluster of them, reaches out and shapes several unrelated things at once. So baldness may never have been a mistake floating alone in the genome with no purpose. It may simply be riding along, bundled together with other traits that genuinely were useful, close enough in the genetic web that you could not pull one thread without disturbing the others. Evolution, in other words, may not have been selecting for baldness at all. It may have been reaching for something helpful nearby, and the thinning hair just came along in the same package, an unavoidable passenger. And there was a second, simpler reason too. Baldness mostly shows up after a person's main years of having children have already passed. And evolution has a very hard time removing any trait that only appears late after the genes have already been handed to the next generation. By the time the hair starts thinning, the important genetic work is already done. The trait slips past evolution's filters simply by arriving too late to matter to whether anyone had children. So it stays, generation after generation. Not because it was ever wanted, but because there was never any strong reason to be rid of it. Sketch let all of this settle. His shrinking tuft was not a defect. It was, in a strange and roundabout way, a shadow cast by something useful. A quiet side effect of the very machinery that had helped his ancestors grow and mature and endure. That was a very different feeling than the panic he had started with. But his journey was not quite finished, because now Sketch wanted to see the proof, the actual physical record. And that is where the story finally becomes something you can hold, and it comes from a place he did not expect: the walls of ancient Egyptian tombs. In 2019, an Egyptology professor named Samar Kamal documented 122 bald men painted across private Egyptian tombs, spanning from around 2600 to 500 before the Common Era. That is more than 2,000 years of continuous artwork made by entirely different generations of painters, and in it, over 100 visibly balding men. Most were shown as clearly older, with white hair still clinging to the sides and nothing on top. Exactly the pattern of natural age-related hair loss. Not shaved heads, not costumes. Just old men, drawn as they truly were. And here is what moved Sketch most. These bald men were not hidden away or mocked or shoved into the corners of the paintings. They were shown proudly, everywhere, doing everything: farming, fishing, sculpting, working as scribes, living full and ordinary lives. In ancient Egypt, going bald was simply treated as a normal part of growing older. Nothing to conceal, nothing to be ashamed of. Kamal's research went even further. The ancient Egyptians had specific words for different stages and patterns of baldness. They even built a baldness line into their careful mummification practices, marking exactly where the natural hair ended. And they recognized several balding hairstyles as perfectly respectable choices, like keeping the remaining hair short all around, or letting it grow longer at the back, while the top stayed bare. An entire culture had quietly, gracefully made peace with the thing that Sketch had been panicking about alone in front of his mirror. And yet, and this is the beautifully human part, those very same people never stopped chasing a cure in private. The bizarre remedies never stopped. They stretched forward across civilization after civilization, cultures that had no contact with one another at all, each one independently arriving at the same conclusion: that baldness is annoying, and a person will try absolutely anything to fix it. In ancient Greece, the famous physician Hippocrates, born around 460 before the Common Era, reportedly rubbed a paste of horseradish, cumin, opium, beetroot, assorted spices, pigeon droppings, and nettles directly onto his own scalp, clearly motivated by a very personal interest in seeing it work. It did not. But Hippocrates did make one genuinely brilliant observation, one that would take roughly 2,000 years to fully explain. He noticed that men who had been castrated before puberty never went bald. He had, without knowing it, spotted the hidden link between the body's hormones and hair loss, thousands of years before anyone could explain why it was true. He saw the pattern perfectly. He just did not know what he was looking at. In ancient Rome, Julius Caesar spent years trying to disguise his own thinning hair. He famously adopted the laurel wreath as a partial cover and, according to historians, invented what may be the very first comb-over in recorded history, growing the hair in the back long and combing it carefully forward across the top. Cleopatra reportedly offered him her own remedy, a mixture of ground-up mice, horse teeth, and bear grease, which, you will not be shocked to learn, also did absolutely nothing. And centuries later, King Louis XIV of France, after losing his hair to a severe illness, launched an entire golden age of enormous, towering wigs across the royal court. Some of them reportedly weighed as much as 20 pounds. And a few of the most extravagant even contained small cages, holding actual living birds, which is precisely the sort of idea a person arrives at only after every sensible option has already failed spectacularly. Sketch, sitting quietly at the edge of his page, began to laugh. Not a bitter laugh, a warm one, because he finally understood the truth that had been waiting for him the whole time. His shrinking tuft was not a private humiliation. It was a membership card to one of the oldest clubs in human history. He was standing shoulder to shoulder with a balding Egyptian swallowing onions and alabaster, with Hippocrates and his pigeon droppings, with Julius Caesar sweeping his hair forward in front of a mirror, with a French king wearing live birds on his head. 4,000 years of frightened, hopeful, wonderfully stubborn creatures, all standing in the same long line, all reaching up to touch the same bare spot. And so, Sketch climbed down off his stool. He walked back to the mirror one more time. He looked at his tuft, smaller now than it used to be, the line drawn a little further back than the day he was made. And this time, he did not press his hands against his head to hold it in place. He did not reach for a remedy. He did not pretend it was not happening. He just looked, and he understood. He understood that the little mischievous molecule at his roots was not out to get him, but simply doing an ancient, thoughtless job. He understood that the pattern on his head was written the same way on every head that had ever carried it. He understood that this trait had followed his ancestors out of Africa 40,000 years ago and had been patiently waiting in his lines the entire time. He understood that evolution had let it stay not out of cruelty, but because it was bundled together with things that had helped his people survive. And he understood that 122 bald men had been painted onto tomb walls with dignity, doing honest work thousands of years before he was ever drawn. So, Sketch made a small decision. He would stop fighting the tide. He would not spend his short, bright life at war with the top of his own head. He would let the line be where the line wanted to be. And here, perhaps, is the gentlest lesson Sketch could offer to anyone watching. The things about us that we are quickest to panic over, quickest to hide, quickest to feel ashamed and alone about, are so often the very things that connect us most deeply to everyone who came before. Your worry is rarely new. Someone stood exactly where you are standing 1,000 years ago, and 2,000, and 4,000, feeling the exact same small, cold jolt of fear, reaching up to touch the exact same bare spot. You are not broken. You are not alone. You are simply the newest person to hold something very, very old. The next time you catch your own reflection doing something you would rather it did not, take a little comfort in the ancient company you are keeping. You are part of a story that followed our ancestors out of Africa, painted itself without shame onto Egyptian tomb walls, drove Julius Caesar to invent the comb-over out of sheer desperation, and convinced otherwise brilliant, accomplished people across the ages to rub donkey hooves and pigeon droppings and lion fat onto their own heads in the desperate hope that something, anything, might finally work. It never did work. 4,000 years, and it still has not worked. But somewhere along the way, a very simple stick figure named Sketch discovered something better than a cure. He discovered that he had never, for one single moment, been standing in that line alone. And he found, at long last, that he could look in the mirror, tuft and all, and simply smile.